Hello and welcome back. This is John Brennan with the Maryland Department of Disabilities. This is the second of our 2 modules covering fair housing. This is Fair Housing Part 2, covering reasonable accommodations. If you recall, we did an overview of fair housing laws in the first module, and this time we're going to focus on reasonable accommodations. Once again, this training is made possible to you by the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, and in particular funding from the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Money Follows the Person program. And the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing is a coalition of affordable housing developers, advocates, stakeholders, and state agencies that work to improve affordable housing opportunities for people with disabilities, and which provides oversight for our 3 current programs, which is the Harry and Jeanette Affordable Weinberg Initiative, the MFP Bridge Subsidy Program, and the HUD 811 PRA Program. And now I'll turn it over to Lisa Sloan from TAC to handle the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, John. So what are we going to go over in this module? We're going to talk about a couple of important fair housing concepts, specifically reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification. We're going to talk about the term reasonable because that's really critical in understanding how to use this tool provided by the fair housing laws. We're going to go over some examples of accommodations in the various parts of the housing cycle, and we'll talk about who pays for reasonable modifications. As with the first module, this webinar is intended to inform you and not serve as legal advice, and you should only use this as a guide, and there are other legal sources to look for if you are moving in that direction. Okay, let's start with a few fair housing concepts, specifically reasonable accommodation. For those of you who participated in Module 1, the overview of fair housing laws that John just mentioned, the concept of reasonable accommodation runs through all the federal laws and the state Maryland law. The Fair Housing Act, Section 504, and ADA all include this concept. So a reasonable accommodation is a change to rules, policies, practices, or procedures in housing if they're needed to enable a person with a disability to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy the housing. So in a very simple, straightforward example, if a housing development has no pets rule, what is going to happen to a person who has a service animal? The law requires that the owner provide a reasonable accommodation to allow a person who has a service or companion animal to live in the development. So it's pretty straightforward, although there's a lot of gray area around what's reasonable, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. The second important concept I wanted to go over with you was the concept of reasonable modifications. A reasonable modification is a specific version of the reasonable accommodation in which a person with a disability requests a physical modification rather than a change to a policy or procedure. So for example, in a property that has one of those really heavy front doors that a person using a wheelchair may not be able to open, an electric door opener might be a reasonable modification. Because without some way to assist with door opening, the individual cannot live in the building. They won't be able to get in and out, and they're being excluded from that program and potentially discriminated against. So that would be an example potentially of a reasonable modification. So we're going to go over some more examples in a few minutes. As I keep alluding to, the really key word here is reasonable. The accommodation or the modification doesn't have to be made by the owner, the property manager, if it's not reasonable. Whether or not something is reasonable or not depends on the specific situation at the time the request for the accommodation or modification is made. And those requests that result in what we call a fundamental alteration to the program, or which pose an undue financial and administrative burden, i.e. are too costly, are not considered reasonable and don't have to be made by the owner. Conversely, accommodations or modifications which would be considered reasonable, which do not pose an undue financial or administrative burden, or which do not result in a fundamental alteration to the program, would be considered considered reasonable, and if an owner is not willing to do them, it would be considered discriminatory. Going back to the issue of each request is their own request at a point in time, an accommodation may be reasonable at one point in time, for example, when a property has a lot of reserves, but not at another point in time, maybe 5 years later, if the property just finished a large rehab and its reserves are low. So everything's going to be on a case-by-case basis. The determination of whether something is an undue financial administrative burden, as we said, is on a case-by-case basis. And here are some of the factors that would be considered. The cost of the accommodation, the financial resources of the provider, the housing development, the benefits that the accommodation would provide to the requester. Is this going to make or break whether they can live in this development or not? And the availability of alternative accommodations that would effectively meet the requester's disability-related needs. So, for example, if somebody is requesting a bunch of access changes to their unit, but there is another unit that is fully accessible already, that may be considered a reasonable alternative depending on how comparable the units are, how complicated a move it might be. Again, all of this is determined on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say asking a housing authority to provide personal care for a tenant would probably not be considered reasonable unless the housing authority provides this type of service already, which most of them don't. And the reason it would not be reasonable, it would be considered a fundamental alteration to the work of a housing authority. They don't already do this. This is very different than what they do, which is owning and taking care and renting out of apartments. Doing personal care is not something that they do generally. Another example, asking a property manager to drive a tenant who has a visual disability to the store is, again, not going to be considered reasonable unless the manager provides such a service to tenants kind of regularly. Again, because this would be an example of a fundamental alteration to the work of the property manager. Again, I'm giving examples. There may be situations in which it would be considered perfectly reasonable, and there may be situations in which it's not reasonable and the property manager is still willing to do it. So this is a very, it's not a black and white area, it's a very gray area. In the third example, requesting installation of a roll-in shower, which is a fairly expensive modification, might be considered reasonable in a 200-unit or a large property, but not reasonable in a 10-unit property, a smaller property that probably doesn't have the depth of reserves that you see in the larger property. Okay, are you guys ready for a pop quiz already? I'm going to give 4 examples, and I want you to think about whether these are reasonable or not. So I'm going to ask it. I'm giving you a couple seconds to think about it, and then I'll give you the answer. So in the first question, is it reasonable to allow a person with a disability who has a documented psychological dependence on a cat to keep the animal in their unit, even if the development has a no pet rule? Do you think that's reasonable or not? And I would say the answer is yes. Generally, it is going to be reasonable. It's a small animal. As long as the individual can take care of it and make sure that the cat doesn't lead to any lease violations, seems pretty reasonable to me. Let's look at the second one. Is it reasonable to allow a person who has a documented need for an overnight attendant in their unit to be on the waiting list for both a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom apartment? Is that reasonable? Yes, I would say the answer is yes. It's perfectly reasonable. The person who needs the overnight attendant might really want a 2-bedroom apartment, but if the 2-bedroom list is a lot longer, it's going to take longer for them to get a unit than the 1-bedroom, they might really be willing to take a 1-bedroom and have the attendant in the living room on a pull-out couch so that they are housed more quickly. So there's no cost or very little cost to have people on more than one waiting list. So it seems to me that that would be reasonable. Let's look at a third example, or a third question. Is it reasonable to rent to a person who has no rent history or no traditional rent history? For example, they've only lived in a group home or only lived with their family because of their disability. Do you think it's reasonable for an owner to rent to someone with no rent history? And I would say yes, it is reasonable. So an owner may have a policy that they like to look at people's rent history to see whether they're going to be a good tenant or not, and so they're not sure what to do when somebody has no rent history. So if that situation was related to disability, it would certainly be reasonable to say, I need a reasonable accommodation, I need a change to your policy. But it's also okay for the landlord to ask the applicant to find other ways to demonstrate that he or she will be a good tenant. So for example, in terms of being able to pay rent on time, maybe this individual has some sort of bill they pay where they are for cable or phone. If they can show that they pay that bill on time consistently, that would be a way that they could show that they could pay rent. They could demonstrate to that owner. If the individual lives in a group home, they could, the owner could ask for a reference for the group home to say that they kept their room neat, that they got along with their roommates or housemates. Again, kind of similar to what the owner wants to know, that you'll get along with your neighbors and that you'll keep the apartment clean. So those are okay things for the owner to ask within reason. And the last one is it reasonable to allow a person who has a substance abuse disability or disorder who begins to drink to remain in a sober housing program? What do you think? Is that reasonable? I think in most cases it's probably not reasonable that this is a sober housing program, and allowing somebody there who is not complying with that, is not similar to the other people, not complying with that requirement would probably be a fundamental alteration. It really undermines the purpose of that community, and probably it's not reasonable. Okay, good job. Let's look at the idea of reasonable accommodation. Let's look at examples of how reasonable accommodation can be used and comes up in various aspects of the housing cycle, from application through occupancy. So what about application? What are some types of reasonable accommodations that people with disabilities might need to be able to apply to housing? So for example, someone with a visual disability might need an application provided in an alternative format, such as Braille or large print. Other persons might need assistance completing the application. Someone who, for example, is in a nursing facility or can't drive might need to have the application dropped off by a friend or family member. They can't deliver it in person. They may need to mail or fax in an application. Again, not bring it in person. They might even need the property manager to visit them in the nursing facility or in wherever they're living in order to help complete an application. And in some cases, that might be perfectly reasonable. Someone who needs assistance completing the application may need additional time to submit an application. And some people might want a secondary contact person to be on the application if there's someone who has an address that is not secure. If they expect to, for some reason, miss some correspondence from the housing provider, it can't hurt to have a second person, like a family member or case manager, on the application, so they also receive correspondence from the housing provider. So those are just some examples of what are probably, in most cases, reasonable accommodations to allow somebody to participate in the housing program. If you can't fill out the application, if you can't get the application into the housing manager, you can't participate in the program. So this is a really critical step. And many of these activities would be considered reasonable in most housing programs. Let's talk about, once you apply and you're placed on a waiting list, what kind of reasonable accommodations might be needed at this point. Well, for example, if a person is in the hospital or is in an institution and for some reason misses some correspondence. They didn't have a secondary contact on their application, and they miss a waiting list update letter. That's the point at which housing agency writes to everybody on their waiting list to see if they're still interested in housing. If they don't respond, or they respond no, they take them off the waiting list. So if that happens to somebody and you can demonstrate it was because they were in the hospital or for some other disability-related reason missed the update letter, you can request an accommodation to have them reinstated to the waiting list, and not just at the bottom, but to the point that they should have been originally. And again, another accommodation would be requesting copies of correspondence be sent to a secondary contact to kind of avoid that situation. Once someone comes to the top of the waiting list, most housing providers will screen an application, do a background check to make sure that the applicant can meet the requirements of the lease and will be a good tenant. This can include landlord references, a criminal record check, and other kinds of background checks. At that point, they may also have to provide things like income documentation. This slide provides a few examples of reasonable accommodations around the screening stage. For example, a person with a disability might need some extra time to gather documentation for verification and screening purposes. If you are, for example, in a nursing facility, it's not really necessarily easy for you to find your birth certificate. You might need some assistance from a discharge planner or from a transition staff person or case manager to help track that down, and it may take some time. A person with a disability might have a poor tenancy history because of their disability. For example, someone with substance abuse disorder or a history of mental illness or others may have some poor tenancy history, and in some cases a criminal history. The fair housing laws that we've been talking about and this concept of reasonable accommodation require landlords to consider reasonable accommodations at this stage. A person who has this poor tenancy history because of their disability. So for example, if a person has a substance abuse disorder and because of that disability, so they were using illegal drugs, they are no longer using illegal drugs, but they are protected, they're entitled to a reasonable accommodation, they can request a reasonable accommodation. So let's say I have a history of mental illness, and when I was not taking my medication, I started not being able to take care of my apartment, I didn't pay my rent on time, and eventually I got evicted. Since that time, I've, things are better for me. I'm in a better place, I have a great case manager, I'm taking my medications, and for a couple of years now I'm in a good space and I want to go back to living in the community. If I can show that my poor tenancy history is related to my mental illness and that I was having a hard time and that things have changed, and I can demonstrate that if the owner makes an accommodation, i.e. lets me in even though their policy says I should be screened out, if I can demonstrate that I'm going to be a good tenant, then the owner should be able to provide me a reasonable accommodation. This again is a very gray area, but it's a really important and useful tool to helping some tenants get in who might otherwise be excluded from housing. So once you become a tenant, with or without accommodations, other kinds of accommodations might be needed and are available during occupancy. So for example, persons who have a lot of equipment that uses a lot of electricity might need an increased utility allowance. A person who has a live-in aid might be entitled to an extra bedroom, or if you have so much equipment that you really need extra space and the apartments are very small, you might be entitled to an extra bedroom for that. A reasonable accommodation during occupancy might be holding the unit for the tenant while the tenant is in the hospital or a nursing facility for some relatively short period of time. As long as you pay your rent, the owner should be willing to hold that unit for you. and then around some lease violations. So similar to the example I just talked about around screening, so if I'm a person, again, with a disability, potentially with a mental illness, and I have a hard time again, or maybe I don't have a bad history, and now as a tenant, I'm having a hard time. I'm stopping taking my meds. I'm behaving in ways that violate the lease. I may need an accommodation to avoid an eviction for lease violation. I'm only going to be entitled to that if I can show that I'm engaging in changes that will result in me complying with my lease. But a reasonable accommodation can be used to help make sure my tenancy is maintained once things are stable for me. Again, a really useful and important tool. So we've just went through kind of some basics of using reasonable accommodation from application to occupancy in a unit. I want to just say a couple of quick words about the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is the tenant-based voucher program. People with disabilities can also request accommodations in this program. And a couple of examples that are useful would be around potentially an increased payment standard. So for example, if you are looking for wheelchair accessible units and the only accessible units in your community are in the more expensive neighborhood, the old buildings don't have, in the other neighborhood, the buildings are older, they don't have accessible units. There's a part of town that has a lot of new buildings, really great accessible units, but more expensive. Maybe they're closer to the public transportation or something. You can request an increased payment standard indicating that the only place you can find housing is in this area. That might be a reasonable accommodation. Often people need increased time to identify a unit. This is again an accommodation that can be requested for that program. So let's try to apply what we just learned about reasonable accommodation to a specific scenario and situation to think about how you might be able to use it. So the slide you see above has a story about a woman named Violet. Violet's a person with complex medical and health needs. She has a history of mental illness and substance abuse. Right now, she's in a nursing facility, but in the past, she has lived in her own apartment. She has a poor rental history. She has a recent eviction, a history of homelessness. You, as a case manager, have helped Violet apply for housing, but she's been denied several times because of her poor tenancy history. What are you going to do? What are some strategies at this point that you can discuss with Violet in order to assist her with her housing search? So how can we think about some of the things we just learned about reasonable accommodation and fair housing to help Violet, who really is, there are a lot of reasons on the surface that owners should not take her. She really, right now, doesn't have a ton going for her. Well, I would start by discussing her tenancy history with her. Make sure that you do that. You want to understand what her tenancy history is and what pieces of it are disability related. You want to get her to be as honest and complete with her as possible. And once you can identify whether or not the issues are disability related, you'll know whether a reasonable accommodation request would be appropriate. I think understanding and being able to tell a landlord a person's story is very critical and can be very helpful. You want to understand what's changed for Violet. Has she been through rehab? Is she not using substances anymore? Is she taking her meds now or otherwise dealing with her mental illness? What are the ways in which Violet can show an owner that real change has happened and she is not likely to repeat the tenancy issues? I would wonder whether she owes any back rent or utilities. If she does, I think starting to do a payment plan with her previous owner would be very useful, or with a utility company, so that Violet can tell a potential landlord that she did have issues, but she's paying her back rent, and this might even improve the landlord references that she's been getting. Check with Violet her criminal record. Make sure it's correct. I'd like to think she doesn't have one, but if she does, make sure it's correct. Sometimes they're incorrect, and owners have a chance sometimes to view criminal records, and we'll use that in the screening process. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. Positive letters of reference can help. Who can attest to the kinds of changes that Violet is going through? Who can attest to the support that she will get? I'm sure there's some other ideas that you could use as well to help people who have these kinds of very intractable, difficult histories. But I think reasonable accommodation is really a good tool to have in your toolkit with folks who you are trying to help move into the community. As I said before, reasonable modification is a very specific example of an accommodation. It's about physical modifications that are needed in an apartment to make sure a person with a disability can live in and use that apartment. So what are some of the rules around modifications? This slide illustrates some of them. Owners have to allow tenants to make reasonable modifications, underline allow. Owners may require a tenant to restore a unit upon move out. They can require assurances that the work, if any work is going to be done in the unit, is done in a professional manner. They can negotiate some funds in an escrow account for the restoration, because owners can, as I said, require the unit to be restored to its original condition. However, owners can't require an increased security deposit because of these kinds of modifications. So what about paying for these modifications? Well, if somebody is purely in a purely private situation, the housing is private and they're not using any federal funds to pay for the unit, to access the unit, and the owner has not accepted any capital funds or operating assistance, we go back to the previous slide in which the owner has to allow the tenant to make modifications, but the owner is not going to pay for it. However, in housing that receives federal funds, such as public housing authorities, assisted housing, these under Section 504 may be required to pay for certain physical modifications. It's going to depend. Again, it's going to go back to our old friend, what is reasonable? What is reasonable will depend on, as we talked about before, is this a 200-unit building or is this a 10-unit building? Does the owner own multiple buildings, or is this the only location that the owner has invested in? So is the installation of a flasher for a person who cannot hear generally reasonable? Probably yes. It's not a super expensive thing to do and would be really a critical item for a person to be able to use that unit and to be safe in terms of being able to exit in case of fire or other emergencies. But in some cases, putting flashers in may involve some expensive rewiring, and in which case an owner might argue it's not. But in most cases, it probably is reasonable. What about the installation of a roll-in shower? Earlier, we talked about the difference in expectations between property, again, that has 200 units and 10 units. Again, something that is this expensive, it is probably less reasonable than flashers, but in a big development with larger reserves, financial reserves, and no units, for example, that have roll-in showers, it might really be a reasonable request. It's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. As I said before, the private owner is not required to pay for modifications. They just have to allow modifications to be made. That's the standard in the Fair Housing Act that would apply to those private owners. Owners who accept a mobile or tenant-based housing choice voucher are not covered by 504, and so they are not required to pay for modification. However, one thing that a housing choice voucher participant may want to consider is asking the housing authority for an increased payment standard to pay for some costs if the owner agrees to make and pay for modification. So let's say an owner agrees to put in an automatic door opener, make some modifications in the bathroom, and those things come to a cost of, $7,000. By having an increased payment standard, by paying a little bit more rent for that unit, the housing choice participant is helping to cover the costs of that apartment. And some owners are going to feel like that's something that they would like to do and they're willing to do, but they're not necessarily required to pay for it, as we discussed before. So those are the general concepts we wanted to cover. John, are there any questions from our audience today?
Yes, we have several questions. The first one is, can a landlord refuse to rent to a person who has a nonviolent criminal history?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the answer would be yes. They can refuse as long as they're not refusing to rent on the basis of any covered characteristics, which I would remind you would include sex, religion, familial status, race, and disability. As long as underlying the reason they're refusing to rent to them is nothing related to a covered characteristic, they can reject that person. Some owners, if they have public money in their properties, so if they're an assisted housing provider or housing authority, may have some stricter rules around who they can and can't exclude, but technically, in general, as long as you're not excluding them based on covered class, you can refuse people. Any more questions?
Yes, the next one is, does a housing program that receives low-income housing tax credits have to pay for reasonable accommodations?
So this is a really important question, and the answer is no. And the reason is that Section 504 does not cover the low-income housing tax credit program. We tend to think of that program as a federal program, but it is a tax credit program that's run by the IRS, not a HUD program in which actual grant funds are provided to an assisted housing program. It's a tax credit program. And so thus far it's been ruled that 504 does not cover that program. Fair Housing Act covers the program, but as we talked about before, the Fair Housing Act only requires that owners allow modifications to be made, not necessarily to pay for them. I would say that in at least one state, state law is such that the tax credit developments would actually be required to pay, but nothing in federal law takes it to that level. Next question, please.
This one is related, and you may have already answered it, but it would be good to stress it again. Does a landlord need to pay for reasonable modifications if the property receives HUD-funded project-based rental assistance in some of the units?
It's going to depend a little bit on the if the whole property is funded clearly, and for most of the HUD-funded programs, if you have some money in the project, it covers your whole program. So the answer would be yes. So even in an example, you in Maryland have the 811 program, and in 811, no more than 25% of the units are going to have 811 operating assistance, but still that whole program, that whole development is covered by the requirement to make reasonable modifications. So yes would be the answer.
Okay, here's another interesting one. Can a landlord refuse to allow a person to have a companion dog if the breed is on the list of dogs considered dangerous and therefore banned by law from multifamily housing?
Yes, definitely. If it's not reasonable, an accommodation doesn't have to be made. So in this case, the policy we're talking about is the breed, that the particular breed is banned. That's the policy. And a change, a requested change to that policy, even though it's based on disability, might not be reasonable if the reason for the policy is this dog would threaten tenants and threaten other tenants. So I think it would be easy to find that this would not be a reasonable request. The person would have to find a different animal or move somewhere else.
Okay. What are some examples of situations where a person can request a reasonable accommodation related to criminal background?
Good question. So one example that comes to mind, it would be around substance abuse. So, you know, there are different kinds of criminal record around possession of illegal drugs. So, for example, if somebody had a conviction related to possession of a small amount of an illegal drug, that it was really evident that it was for their own use, and they were a person who was willing to say that they were a person with a substance abuse disorder and they were now in recovery, I mean, that person, clearly depending on what their whole record looks like, but I would say small possession of a small amount of an illegal drug, if you're a substance abuser, you could argue, but you're currently not using, you could argue reasonable accommodation. But if that same conviction was for larger amounts and you had been convicted of possession for sale, it would be, I think, much more difficult to request an accommodation around that. Maybe another example would be some sort of conviction around shoplifting, and you could indicate that the incident was disability related, maybe a manic episode or something else, that a reasonable accommodation would be, might be reasonable, an accommodation request might be reasonable around that as well. I would say, so criminal convictions that are not threatening to other tenants, not likely to be repeated, are things that one might be able to request an accommodation around. Any more questions?
Yes, we have one more. Do public utilities need to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, such as creating payment plans or forgiving bills in arrears if the person was hospitalized?
The answer is yes. Businesses are covered by the ADA, and the ADA has reasonable accommodation requirements. So the public utilities would have to provide accommodations that were reasonable. So probably depends on the size of the bill and how many times this had happened in terms of forgiveness. I'm sure they're always happy to enter into payment plans. Was that the last question, John?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, thank you. This last slide provides you with some links to some additional resources on the topic of reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. We hope you found this two-part module series helpful. We thank you for your participation. Bye-bye.